So I read the next 20 pages of the Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and he's continuing with the same story that he introduced in the previous passage of the Korean airlines, but this time he gives another story. He gives another story of another airplane, and this time it wasn't a Korean airline; it was another airline. So this is a successful story of where there was about to be a crash, but then the pilot handles the situation correctly, and his calmness and his use of last moment intelligence and that practical IQ that he mentioned before leads to him being able to divert what could have been a big catastrophe. So he tells the story of this small airplane. They were flying through, and then one of the passengers fell very ill. So they decided that they have to land. But since they had too much oil and there was still too much fuel in the airplane, they couldn't land safely. So the captain immediately told air traffic control what he needed, and he explained to him the situation, that there's someone ill, there's too much fuel, what should I do? And he got the proper assistance, and he was able to communicate the problem correctly. And because of that, things were able to run smoothly. So he was able to put the massive, full, heavy jet on the ground in time to save the ill patient. And the success again came because he stayed calm, because he communicated himself, and because he listened to his inferiors and to the peers that were around him. And this is in contrast to the Korean story, which Gladwell later touches upon. And then before he goes back to the Korean story that he mentioned in the previous passage, he gives another example of a doomed flight. The Avencia 502, 052, my bad. So the plane had to divert several times from its planned route, and it was running dangerously low because it wasn't following the route. It was going from one place to another instead of going straight to its destination. So the pilot repeatedly tells the officer to tell the air traffic control that they don't have enough fuel, that there's a problem. But the officer tells the ATC that the airplane is running out of fuel, but he doesn't tell the ATC, meaning the air traffic control, that it's an emergency. So he's just like, there's not enough fuel, and because he doesn't use the word emergency, or he doesn't even seem concerned at all, the ATC doesn't take it seriously. So the airplane eventually runs out of fuel, and the plane crashes, and everybody on board dies, alongside the pilot and the first officer. And Gladwell, when he's dissecting this case, he says that it's clearly the first officer's fault in this situation, because he wasn't able to communicate what he needed to communicate. He didn't tell the air traffic control that this was an emergency. He just told them that they were running low on fuel. What is the air traffic control supposed to do just from that? And so Gladwell then introduces a psychological concept where he says there's two types of societies. There's societies where there's a high power differential, meaning that people who are in authority, when people who are lower than them, they speak to them or they interact with people who are their superiors, there's more of that aspect of respect. So how you speak to them, how you talk about them, how you talk when you're around them, you have to keep that in mind. Those are the high authority differential societies. In Korea, where these type of airplane crashes were common, this is very common in that place, because that's what's considered respect. When you don't talk back to your elders or your or people who are in your authority, when you imply more than you explicitly say, that's what's considered respectful in that culture. So again, going back to that cultural heritage leading to success. And then Gladwell later says that if the first officer wasn't so shy into saying what he needed to say to in the ATC, then maybe that crash wouldn't have happened. It's that cultural background that became a barrier, became a hindrance in him being able to properly communicate. And then he later makes the point that that other societies, such as our society here in Canada and many Western countries, that sort of a power differential doesn't exist. So even an inferior can talk right back or talk in face to someone who is much higher than him in rank or in class or in a job position, for example. And that sort of barrier does not exist in communication, and because of that, people can more effectively communicate what they need. And this sort of and in this situation, for example, an airplane about to crash, in this sort of situation, communication is very important. And because these sort of hindrances don't exist, good communication can happen, and catastrophes such as this can be avoided. And this is exactly what Gladwell argues. And in 2000, Gladwell also mentions that in 2000, Korean Airlines brought in experts to analyze why so many crashes were happening, and this is what the experts said, that the lack of communication, and to help with that, they brought in language teachers who taught the pilots and the first officers to speak in English, to break that the cultural hindrance that came with their language. Again, going back to his argument that culture has a big play in events that happen in a person's life, and at the end, the overall success a person tastes in his life. So the culture, the aspect of culture, and so that's where he ends this passage off at. And overall, I was very convinced by this argument that he made of the cultural impact. This is not something that I thought about from before. I had a hunch that culture and background had an effect, but more than I never thought it would go back as far as culture. Right? Culture is I believed it to be family. A person's childhood has an effect on how they're going to be for the rest of their life. I knew that, but I didn't know that it could be as far back as what your grandparents did, or where your grandparents lived, or even further back. Their actions can have such a significant effect on my actions today. And this is very interesting to know, and it can almost lead to a person to thinking that they're prisoners to their cultural identity, but I don't think that's what the author wants us to think. He wants us to know that culture has an effect on us. It's a factor that can lead to our success, but it's not the end all and be all.